Ellen Harper had always been someone who craved simplicity. Growing up in the city, she often dreamed of wide-open spaces, fresh air, and a life far removed from the constant noise and chaos of urban living. For years, she saved every penny she could, determined to turn her dream into reality. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she found it. A modest ranch nestled at the edge of a quiet suburban community. It wasn't grand or luxurious, but to Ellen, it was perfect. The ranch came with rolling green pastures, a small barn that needed a little love, and enough space for her to breathe freely again. The first thing Ellen did was bring in her chickens. She'd fallen in love with these quirky birds during a visit to a friend's farm years ago. There was something magical about their clucking chatter, the way they wandered around with curious eyes, and how they seemed to have personalities all their own. To Ellen, they weren't just animals. They were companions, each one unique and endearing. Every morning, Ellen would step outside with a warm cup of coffee in hand, watching as her chickens scurried across the yard. They greeted her with soft clucks, almost as if they were saying hello. Feeding them became her favorite part of the day. She'd scatter seeds on the ground, laughing as they flapped their wings and chased after the treats. Some of them even followed her around like loyal puppies, pecking gently at her boots or hopping onto the low fence to get a better view of what she was doing. It was peaceful. It was simple. And for Ellen, it was healing. Life hadn't always been easy for her. A few years back, she'd gone through a painful divorce that left her feeling lost and broken. During those dark days, the chickens became her lifeline. Caring for them gave her a sense of purpose when everything else felt uncertain. Their presence reminded her that life went on, no matter how hard things got. Whether it was collecting eggs in the early morning light or sitting quietly beside them as they scratched in the dirt, Ellen found comfort in their company. They didn't judge her or demand anything in return. They simply existed, offering unconditional acceptance. Her neighbors, at first, seemed friendly enough. They waved from their manicured lawns and exchanged polite smiles when they passed by. Ellen thought she'd finally found a place where she belonged. But what she didn't realize was that her new home came with rules. Rules set by the Homeowners Association, HOA, a group of people tasked with maintaining order and uniformity in the neighborhood. At first, Ellen didn't pay much attention to them. She figured as long as she kept her property tidy and respected others, everything would be fine. But deep down, trouble was brewing. Little did Ellen know, her beloved chickens would soon become the center of a controversy she never saw coming. For now, though, life on the ranch was blissful. Every sunrise brought new opportunities to connect with her feathered friends, and every evening ended with a sense of calm that only nature could provide. Ellen couldn't imagine anything disrupting the harmony she'd worked so hard to create. But sometimes, life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the gentle breeze, Ellen stepped out onto her porch with a steaming mug of coffee. The air smelled of earth and grass, and everything seemed picture perfect. But when she reached for the mailbox at the end of her driveway, something caught her eye. An official-looking envelope tucked neatly inside. Her heart skipped a beat. Official envelopes usually meant bills or paperwork, but this one had the Homeowners Association, HOA, logo stamped on the corner. Ellen's stomach tightened as she tore it open. Inside was a letter written in formal language that made her head spin. It stated that her property was in violation of Clause 3.7 of the HOA's covenant. No more than 6 non-commercial fowl allowed per household. 6 chickens. That was all they permitted. Ellen reread the sentence twice, her mind racing. She had 15 chickens, a lively mix of hens and roosters that brought so much joy to her life. How could anyone expect her to part with them? At first, Ellen tried to brush it off. Surely it was a mistake. Maybe someone miscounted her flock or misunderstood her setup. After all, her chickens weren't noisy pests. They were well-behaved creatures who spent most of their time scratching around her yard and laying eggs. She decided to ignore the letter, hoping it would go away if she didn't respond. But 2 weeks later, another envelope arrived, this time with a firmer tone. The HOA demanded immediate compliance, warning of fines if she failed to reduce her flock to the allowable limit. The weight of the situation began to sink in. Fines. Compliance. Ellen felt a knot forming in her chest. This wasn't just about rules anymore. It felt personal. Her chickens weren't just animals. They were family. They'd been there for her during some of the hardest moments of her life, offering comfort and companionship when no one else could. Giving them up wasn't an option. As the days passed, Ellen noticed subtle changes in her neighborhood. Neighbors who once smiled warmly now avoided making eye contact. Some whispered behind her back as they walked their dogs past her fence. One afternoon, while tending to her garden, Ellen overheard a snippet of conversation from across the street. "Too many chickens," a woman said, shaking her head disapprovingly. Another neighbor chimed in. "It's ruining the look of the place." Ellen sighed heavily, feeling a pang of loneliness creep in. She hadn't expected her little slice of paradise to become a battleground. What surprised her even more was how quickly people turned against her. It wasn't just the HOA breathing down her neck. It was the entire community. For the first time since moving to the ranch, Ellen felt like an outsider. Still, she refused to give up without a fight. Sitting on her porch that evening, surrounded by the soft clucking of her chickens, Ellen thought about her next move. These birds had given her so much. They deserved better than to be cast aside because of someone else's arbitrary rules. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Ellen resolved to find a way to protect her feathered friends. Whatever it took, she wouldn't let them down. But deep down, doubt lingered. Could she really stand up to the HOA and win? Or would she have to make sacrifices she wasn't ready for? Only time would tell. Ellen spent the next few days in a fog of worry, trying to figure out what to do. Her mind raced with possibilities, but none of them felt right. Selling or giving away her chickens was unthinkable. They weren't just animals. They were part of her daily life, her routine, her happiness. Fines from the HOA would pile up quickly, and she couldn't afford that either. Fighting back seemed like the only option, but how? She didn't know where to start. Desperate for answers, Ellen reached out to friends who lived in neighborhoods with similar rules. Some suggested she negotiate with the HOA, explaining how much the chickens meant to her. Others advised her to hire a lawyer, though the idea of legal fees made her stomach churn. One friend mentioned something about emotional support animals, ESAs, but Ellen dismissed it at first. Chickens as ESAs. That sounded ridiculous, almost laughable. Yet the thought stuck in her mind, nagging at her like a stubborn pebble in her shoe. Determined to explore every avenue, Ellen decided to visit her therapist, Dr. Lewis. She'd been seeing him regularly since her divorce, and he knew better than anyone how much her mental health had improved since moving to the ranch. During their session, Ellen opened up about the HOA's demands and the stress it was causing her. "These chickens aren't just pets," she explained, her voice trembling slightly. "They're my family. They help me stay calm when I feel overwhelmed. Feeding them, talking to them, it's therapy for me." Dr. Lewis listened intently, nodding as Ellen spoke. When she finished, he leaned forward and said, "You know, there's no rule that says emotional support animals have to be dogs or cats. If these chickens genuinely improve your mental well-being, then they could qualify as ESAs." Ellen's eyes widened. Could it really be that simple? She asked him if he'd be willing to write a letter confirming her need for the chickens as part of her emotional support system. To her relief, he agreed. With newfound hope, Ellen began researching ESA laws. She learned that under certain disability accommodation guidelines, individuals were allowed exceptions to housing rules if their animals provided therapeutic benefits. It wasn't a guaranteed solution, but it was worth a shot. Armed with Dr. Lewis' letter and a growing sense of determination, Ellen drafted a formal response to the HOA. In her letter, she explained that her chickens were not ordinary livestock. They were registered emotional support staff essential to her mental health. She included documentation from Dr. Lewis and cited relevant laws to back up her claim. Sending off the letter felt like tossing a message in a bottle into the ocean. Would the HOA take her seriously? Or would they laugh at the absurdity of chickens being labeled as emotional support staff? Days turned into weeks, and Ellen waited anxiously for a reply. In the meantime, she focused on caring for her flock, finding comfort in their familiar routines. Every morning, she greeted them with fresh water and food, marveling at how each bird had its own quirks. There was Maisie, the curious hen who always followed her around, and Gus, the rooster with a proud strut and a knack for finding hidden snacks. They reminded her why she was fighting so hard, not just for herself, but for them too. As she sat on her porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ellen allowed herself a small smile. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her unconventional argument would work. And if it didn't, well, she'd cross that bridge when she came to it. One thing was certain. She wasn't going down without a fight. The HOA board meeting was in full swing when Ellen's letter landed on the table. It arrived in a crisp white envelope, its contents neatly typed and accompanied by official documentation from Dr. Lewis. The board members exchanged puzzled glances as they passed the papers around. Emotional support chickens. None of them had ever encountered such a claim before. At first, there was silence, followed by quiet chuckles. Surely, this was some kind of joke. But as they read through Ellen's detailed explanation, the room grew quieter. She hadn't just thrown out an outrageous argument. She'd backed it up with legal references, therapist notes, and heartfelt reasoning. Her words painted a picture of someone who relied deeply on her chickens, not for eggs or profit, but for emotional stability. The board president, Mr. Grayson, cleared his throat and broke the silence. "Well," he said, adjusting his glasses, "this is unexpected." The discussion that followed was lively, to say the least. Some members found humor in the idea of chickens serving as emotional support staff. "Do they cuddle with her at night?" one joked, earning scattered laughter. Others, however, were more thoughtful. Mrs. Peterson, a retired teacher known for her soft heart, raised a hand. "We can laugh all we want," she said firmly, "but if these chickens genuinely help her cope with anxiety, isn't that worth considering? Isn't our job to support homeowners within reason?" Not everyone agreed. Mr. Dawson, a no-nonsense businessman, argued that allowing such an exception would set a dangerous precedent. "If we let her keep 15 chickens because they're emotional support staff," he said, emphasizing the phrase with air quotes, "what's stopping someone else from claiming their goats, pigs, or even snakes are necessary for their mental health? Where do we draw the line?" The debate raged on, with opinions divided. On one side were those who believed rules were rules and exceptions couldn't be made without risking chaos. On the other were those who felt sympathy for Ellen's situation and questioned whether enforcing such strict limits was truly fair. After nearly an hour of back and forth, Mr. Grayson called for a temporary recess so everyone could cool down and think things over. Meanwhile, Ellen waited anxiously at home. She had no idea how the board was reacting to her letter, but she hoped they'd see the sincerity behind her plea. To pass the time, she busied herself with chores around the ranch. As she cleaned out the chicken coop, Maisie hopped onto her shoulder, clucking softly as if sensing her owner's unease. Ellen smiled despite herself. "Don't worry, girl," she murmured. "We'll figure this out together." A few days later, the HOA sent their response. They acknowledged receipt of her letter, but pushed back against her claim. In their rebuttal, they stated that while emotional support animals were recognized under certain laws, chickens didn't meet the criteria because they lacked the ability to provide direct emotional interaction, something typically associated with dogs or cats. Ellen sighed heavily as she read the letter. So much for hoping for an easy resolution. Still, she wasn't ready to give up. If anything, the HOA's rejection only fueled her determination. She dug deeper into ESA regulations, determined to prove that her chickens were more than capable of providing comfort. She reached out to online forums where others shared stories of unconventional ESAs, miniature horses, rabbits, even parrots, and found encouragement from people who had successfully fought similar battles. Armed with new information and renewed resolve, Ellen prepared to take her case further. This wasn't just about keeping her chickens anymore. It was about standing up for what mattered most to her, a life filled with peace, purpose, and the companionship of creatures she loved dearly. Whatever happened next, Ellen knew she was fighting not only for herself, but also for anyone else who might face unfair judgment for finding solace in unlikely places. Word of Ellen's standoff with the HOA spread quickly through the neighborhood, like wildfire on a dry summer day. At first, it was just whispers, neighbors exchanging sidelong glances and hushed comments during their morning walks. "Did you hear about Ellen's chickens?" one would ask, eyebrows raised. "She says they're emotional support animals." Another would reply, half amused, half incredulous. But as the story gained traction, opinions began to divide. Some neighbors were firmly on the HOA side, worried that Ellen's situation might lead to chaos if everyone started bending the rules for their pets or livestock. "It's not about the chickens," Mrs. Thompson declared at a book club meeting, her voice sharp. "It's about setting boundaries. If we let this slide, next thing you know, people will be keeping pigs in their backyards or turning their lawns into mini zoos." Her words earned nods of agreement from a few others, but not everyone shared her concerns. On the flip side, a growing number of residents felt sympathy for Ellen. They admired her creativity and determination to fight for what mattered most to her. One afternoon, Ellen noticed a young mother walking by with her 2 children. The kids stopped at Ellen's fence, giggling as Gus strutted proudly along the railing. "Mom, can we go see the chickens?" one of them asked, tugging at her sleeve. The mother hesitated but eventually nodded. "Sure, why not?" she said softly, giving Ellen an apologetic smile. "They seem harmless enough." Encouraged by moments like these, Ellen decided to take a bold step. She organized a small gathering at her ranch, inviting curious neighbors to come meet her chickens and learn more about why they meant so much to her. On the day of the event, she set up chairs under a shady tree, laid out homemade lemonade and cookies, and opened her gate wide. To her surprise and relief, a modest crowd showed up, including some faces she hadn't expected. As guests mingled, Ellen introduced them to her flock. She explained how each chicken had its own personality. Maisie, the friendly hen who loved following her around. Luna, the shy one who preferred hiding in the bushes. And Gus, the rooster who acted like he owned the place. The visitors laughed as the chickens pecked curiously at their shoes or flapped clumsily toward scattered seeds. Children squealed with delight when Ellen handed them freshly laid eggs still warm from the nest. For many, it was their first real interaction with farm animals, and the experience left a lasting impression. One guest, Mr. Carter, admitted he'd initially sided with the HOA. "I thought it was a bit ridiculous, to be honest," he confessed, scratching his head. "But seeing how happy these birds make you, and your neighbors, I'm starting to rethink things." Others echoed similar sentiments, admitting they hadn't realized how much effort Ellen put into caring for her chickens, or how much joy they brought to her life. By the end of the afternoon, Ellen felt a renewed sense of hope. While not everyone walked away fully convinced, she could tell that public opinion was shifting in her favor. Some neighbors even promised to speak up at the next HOA meeting, urging the board to reconsider its stance. For the first time since the controversy began, Ellen didn't feel quite so alone. Still, she knew the battle wasn't over. The HOA wasn't likely to back down easily, and tensions between her and some neighbors remained high. But Ellen took comfort in knowing that she had allies now, people who understood her perspective and believed in her cause. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across her yard, Ellen stood quietly among her chickens, feeling grateful for the unexpected support she'd found. Whatever happened next, She knew she'd given her best shot, not just for herself, but for the little feathered friends who had changed her life in ways she never imagined. The HOA board convened once again, this time under immense pressure, not just from Ellen, but from the growing number of neighbors who had begun to question their rigid stance. The community was buzzing with talk about Ellen's chickens, and opinions were pouring in from all sides. Some residents sent emails or left voicemails urging the board to reconsider, while others showed up at meetings to voice their support for Ellen in person. It was clear that what started as a private dispute had become a neighborhood-wide debate. At the next meeting, the room was unusually full. Several neighbors sat in the back, waiting to see how the board would respond to the mounting public interest. Mr. Grayson, the board president, looked visibly uncomfortable as he shuffled through papers at the head of the table. "We've received quite a bit of feedback regarding Mrs. Harper's situation," he began hesitantly. His tone suggested he wasn't thrilled about the attention the case had attracted. Mrs. Peterson wasted no time jumping into the discussion. "Let's be honest," she said, addressing the group. "This isn't just about rules anymore. People are watching us, our neighbors, our community, and they want to see fairness. Ellen has proven that her chickens aren't causing harm. In fact, they're helping her. Shouldn't we focus on compassion instead of control?" Her words sparked murmurs of agreement among the attendees, but not everyone was convinced. Mr. Dawson remained steadfast in his opposition. "Compassion is one thing," he countered, "but if we make exceptions for every unique situation, where does it end? What happens when someone decides their alpacas or peacocks are emotional support animals too? We'll have chaos on our hands." The argument went back and forth, with each side presenting valid points. But what tipped the scales, ultimately, was the sheer weight of public opinion. A petition signed by over 30 households circulated during the meeting, asking the board to grant Ellen an exception. Even some longtime HOA supporters admitted privately that the backlash against enforcing such strict rules might hurt the association's reputation more than bending them ever could. After hours of heated discussion, the board finally reached a compromise. They agreed to allow Ellen to keep all 15 chickens, but with conditions. First, she had to ensure the flock stayed within her fenced property at all times, minimizing any potential disturbances to neighbors. Second, she needed to address noise concerns, particularly from Gus, whose early morning crowing had been a point of contention. Lastly, the HOA requested that Ellen maintain her property neatly, keeping the coop clean and free of odors. Ellen breathed a sigh of relief when she received the news. While the conditions weren't ideal, they were manageable and far better than losing her beloved chickens altogether. She immediately got to work reinforcing her fence, installing soundproofing panels near the coop, and setting up regular cleaning schedules to keep everything tidy. Her neighbors noticed the effort she put in, and many expressed appreciation for her willingness to cooperate. As weeks turned into months, something remarkable happened. Attitudes began to shift. Neighbors who had once complained about the chickens now found themselves charmed by them. Children begged their parents to visit Ellen's ranch, eager to feed the hens and collect eggs. Adults marveled at how peaceful the birds seemed, wandering contentedly around the yard without causing trouble. Slowly but surely, Ellen's chickens became less of a controversy and more of a cherished part of the neighborhood's character. Even Mr. Dawson softened his stance after witnessing the positive impact Ellen's story had on the community. "I still think it's unconventional," he admitted gruffly during a casual chat at the mailbox, "but I can't deny those chickens bring people together. Maybe there's room for flexibility after all." For Ellen, the victory wasn't just about keeping her flock. It was about proving that sometimes breaking away from rigid rules could lead to unexpected harmony. Her little ranch remained a haven of peace, laughter, and connection, for humans and chickens alike. And though challenges lay ahead, she faced them with renewed confidence, knowing she'd fought hard for what truly mattered. Ellen's victory over the HOA didn't just change her life. It transformed the entire neighborhood. What had started as a tense standoff became a lesson in empathy, compromise, and the power of thinking outside the box. As weeks turned into months, Ellen noticed subtle but meaningful shifts in how her neighbors interacted with her and with each other. The once divided community began coming together in ways no one could have predicted. One Saturday morning, Ellen woke up to find a basket of freshly baked muffins on her porch, accompanied by a note from Mrs. Thompson, the same neighbor who had initially criticized her chickens. "Thank you for teaching us to see things differently," the note read. "P.S. Guess is quite the charmer." Ellen laughed out loud, shaking her head in disbelief. If someone like Mrs. Thompson could soften her stance, anything was possible. The children in the neighborhood especially took to Ellen's chickens. They visited her ranch regularly, learning about caring for animals and even naming some of the newer chicks that hatched in the spring. Ellen loved watching their faces light up as they held an egg still warm from the nest or giggled at Gus's dramatic crowing. For many of them, it was their first real connection to nature, and Ellen cherished being able to share that experience. Even the HOA board seemed different after the ordeal. Emboldened by the positive response to Ellen's case, they revisited some of their stricter rules, making small but significant changes to accommodate individual needs. A new policy allowed homeowners to request exceptions for unique circumstances, provided they could demonstrate a legitimate need. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress, a sign that the community was learning to balance order with compassion. For Ellen, life returned to its peaceful rhythm. Her mornings were filled with the familiar sounds of clucking and scratching as her chickens wandered around the yard. She spent her afternoons tending to her garden or chatting with neighbors who stopped by to say hello. Evenings were reserved for quiet reflection, sitting on her porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues across her little slice of paradise. Her chickens remained at the heart of everything. Maisie still followed her everywhere, while Gus continued his proud patrols around the property. Each bird had its quirks, its habits, its place in Ellen's daily routine. And though they were officially classified as emotional support staff, to Ellen, they were simply family, just as they'd always been. Looking back, she realized how much she'd grown through the struggle. At first, she'd felt isolated, pitted against a system that seemed determined to crush her spirit. But in standing up for what mattered most, she discovered strength she didn't know she had. She'd also learned the value of community, not just in receiving support, but in giving it. By opening her home and her heart to others, she created connections that would last a lifetime. As the seasons changed, so did the neighborhood. Families began planting vegetable gardens inspired by Ellen's lush patch of tomatoes and herbs. Others adopted pets of their own, encouraged by the idea that animals could bring joy and healing into their lives. Slowly but surely, the community evolved into something warmer, kinder, and more inclusive than before. Ellen often thought about how strange it was that chickens had sparked such a transformation. Who would have guessed that 15 feathery creatures could teach an entire neighborhood the importance of understanding and acceptance? Yet here they were, living proof that sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest difference. And so, Ellen's little ranch remained a sanctuary for humans and chickens alike. Life wasn't without its challenges, of course. There were still days when Gus woke everyone up too early, or when feathers scattered across the yard, despite her best efforts to keep it tidy. But those moments were outweighed by laughter, gratitude, and the simple joy of knowing she'd stayed true to herself. In the end, Ellen's story wasn't just about chickens or rules or even victories. It was about resilience, creativity, and the courage to stand up for what matters most. It was about finding beauty in the unexpected and building bridges where walls once stood. Most importantly, it was about proving that even in the face of adversity, kindness and determination could turn conflict into connection, and chaos into calm.